Well, good morning, one and all. Oh, gosh. Yay. The only trouble with holding a handheld mic is I can't gesticulate quite as much as I normally do. I want to start by saying that we serve a sovereign God. I have been blessed so much by this morning's service, by the testimonies and by the worship. And we serve a sovereign God, and our place in that is to get into step with what God's doing. And that's partly what I want to look at today. And I want to look at Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. And these two verses that I'm going to read, they're actually part of a section of Paul's letter to the Philippians. And he starts the section by saying that we need to conduct ourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We need to conduct ourselves in a manner worthy. We don't live good lives to gain salvation. We've got salvation, therefore we live good lives. And this is part of it. And do you know what? I'll read verses 3 and 4, and it says this: do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking out to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. And it's that second bit that I really want to concentrate on, about looking out to the interest of others. And I am glad that as a church, we do that. We do that for each other. We do that for the community that we serve. And we try our best as church to build God's kingdom here on earth. And we do that by conducting our lives in a manner worthy of the gospel. But there is also room for improvement, isn't there? So I think it's always good to revisit things. It's kind of a shame that Steve's not here today. If you're here, Steve, hello, if you're watching. Because actually I'm going to talk mainly on Nehemiah. And I know that Nehemiah is Steve's favourite book of the Bible. And if you think, what have Nehemiah and Philippians 2 verses 3 and 4 got to do with one another, I hope I'll show you. But just in case you don't think that they go together, I'm actually going to use Lego later on to build them together. So there's that to look forward to. So what I'm going to do is I'm briefly going to look at the historic background to Nehemiah. And because actually by looking at what was going on around Jerusalem at the time of Nehemiah, you actually understand the book of Nehemiah better. So for those of you that aren't into history, this is where your time to have a little kip, okay? It'll be fairly obvious when I finish, so anyone, if you sat next to someone asleep, just give them a nudge when I finished off, okay? Then we're going to look briefly, we're going to do an overview of all of Nehemiah, the book and the man, and we're going to look at lessons for ourselves in our lives. So, if I could have the first map up, please. This is a map. Now, it's a bit difficult to see, but if you actually I know you can't read anything on there, but if you actually just look at the coloured blobs on there, you get the sense of how big the kingdom of Israel was under David and Solomon. And it was actually at this time that the kingdom of Israel was at its highest point. It was at its peak. And so that was under David and Solomon. But we know that after Solomon, the kingdom split. And you have Israel and Judah divided. So you've got 10 kingdoms to the north, two to the south. And after that split, there was more rebellion. And God's enemies took away the Jews from the promised land. And so if I could have the next slide, please. I'm sorry, this is really blurry. I was doing this first thing this morning, and the only way I could get it in focus was to have it so small you couldn't actually see the map. But anyway, you can see the darker yellow blob is the Assyrian Empire. They were the empire that captured all of the people in the 10 tribes of Israel, and they took them into exile. If I could have the next slide, please. Here we have the Babylonian Empire. And you can see that's bigger. They defeated, you don't need to know when they defeated the Assyrians. It interests me, I like history, you don't need to know that. But anyway, they took over pretty much Assyria's kingdom and more empire and more as well. And they were the people that deported the Jews from Jerusalem in a small group to start with, and then they were the empire that destroyed Jerusalem in 587. And then the final one, they were succeeded by the Persian Empire, which you can see again is even bigger. And Nehemiah is set during the Persian Empire. Now, it's interesting this because actually the way that those three empires treated their exiles actually has an impact on the people of God in Jerusalem in Nehemiah's time and beyond. Because what Assyria did, the first ones, they actually took exiles and they dispersed them right through their empire. Didn't leave them in groups, they dispersed them. And so basically those 10 tribes of Israel were lost. Now Babylon, what they did was they exiled the Jewish people, but they exiled them in groups. You had one group in Egypt, you had another one in Babylon. And there is one point, and I'm just saying this because I found this really interesting because I never worked out who Samaria was. There's a bit where the Babylonians let some people go back to the land of Israel because Israel was getting, there were lions prowling around, and the Babylonian people thought that they'd angered the god of that area, so they let some exiles go back to show the people that were living in the promised land how to live how God wanted them to. The God of that area, that's what the Babylonians referred to him as. But actually, they didn't actually do that. What they did was they intermarried with the people, and basically the beliefs of God's people there got mixed with the people that were living there, and that became Samaria. Okay? And then Persia, what Persia did, which was the one when Nehemiah was on the throne, what Persia did with their exiles was they actually allowed some of the exiles to go back to their lands. This isn't just the Jews people, this is how they treated all the people that they'd conquered. They allowed them to go back to their lands, and they gave them a certain amount of self-governing autonomy. And that was in some political areas, and also in religious affairs. And so that's where people coming back to Jerusalem happened. Now, in the same way that the people left the promised land in 3 goes, they come back in 3 goes. And the first group that come back is under a priest called Zerubbabel, and they come back to start building the altar and the temple. And they start building that in a certain time, and it started in 538 BC, and it was completed, the temple was finally completed in 516 BC. And that is the 70 years that Jeremiah talks about, that they're going to be out of Jerusalem, exiled, because they hadn't followed the ways of God. Okay, so that's what the first group. The second group was under Ezra, which is the book immediately preceding Nehemiah, and actually they're really good to read together. And the second group was under Ezra, and he went back to Jerusalem in 458, and he went there to teach them the scriptures and show them how to be a religious community again. And then finally we get to Nehemiah, and Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem in 458. Sorry, I've written the same one down. He doesn't go there in 458, he goes in 445, sorry. I've written the same time down. But anyway, he was there for 12 years. So they went away in 3 sections, they came back in 3 sections. And what Nehemiah does is he's the third lot of the exiles to come back. Right, that's the history book done. So if anyone's asleep, give them a nudge, okay? And then there is a reason. It does actually help you understand and put into context what Nehemiah does. Also at this time, books of the Bible, just in case you're interested, Haggai, Zechariah and Malachi, all at the same time. same period. So first of all, we'll get to an overview of the book of Nehemiah. And the first thing that we find out in chapter 1 and verse 3 is that Nehemiah finds out that the people of Jerusalem are in trouble. He asks for a report, and he gets told, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. Now, at this point in time, Nehemiah is a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, who was the ruler of the empire of Persia. And Nehemiah is distraught at the news. So he learns of difficulties, and what he does is he requests help. He requests help from God. We see his prayer first of all. And then he requests help from Artaxerxes. And he says, Artaxerxes asks him why he's so sad. Because actually the cupbearer and the king, they would have had an awful lot of close communion with one another. Because obviously, as the cupbearer, what he did was he tasted his drink and his food to make sure that no one was trying to poison the king. So it was quite a close personal relationship. So he requests help, and he's granted help by Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes says, what do you want to do about it? And he sends Nehemiah off. And you find out later on in Nehemiah that he actually makes Nehemiah governor of Jerusalem. And the first thing that Nehemiah does is he rests up, and then he assesses the situation of the walls. How bad are they? So he goes at night and he looks around. Once he's assessed the problem, he then organises the physical rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And we see that, and that takes up the first 6 chapters of the book of Nehemiah. But it's not just about the physical rebuilding of the walls, it's also about the spiritual rebuilding of the people. And then we get an interlude in Nehemiah which is very similar to Ezra, where Ezra reads the law to the people, and they repent and they recommit themselves to the covenant of God. And throughout all this book, we see that there is opposition. And it's not just opposition. It's not just opposition occasionally. It's constant opposition all around. And the enemies of Jerusalem, sorry, this is a bit of another historical bit, but they were literally all around and about. You had a guy called Sanballat, who was the governor of Samaria. And he was an enemy because actually he could potentially have been ruling over Jerusalem at the same time. And Nehemiah coming along, it decreases Sanballat's influence. Then there's a guy called Tobiah, who was in another area of Jerusalem. Then there's another guy listed called Geshem the Arab, who was in another area but outside of Jerusalem. And then there was the Ashdods. So north, south, east, west, it was surrounded. The city of Jerusalem was surrounded by enemies. Now, they couldn't attack Jerusalem outright because Jerusalem was part of the Persian Empire, but they all had designs on it. They wanted to control it for their own personal gain, for wealth. And it's interesting that Jerusalem is always has been, always will be a pivotal place in history. Amen. Always has been. And if you want to read that, read Daniel chapter 9, verses 25 following. There is always going to be opposition to what goes on in Jerusalem because the devil knows that actually Jerusalem is where it's at. And if he can destroy Jerusalem, the prophecies that God has spoken over it can't be fulfilled. So it's strategically important, financially, politically. It was important to Persia because Jerusalem was very near to Egypt, and it was a way of keeping control over Egypt. Because actually where Nehemiah was and the ruler was, it was 1,000 miles from Jerusalem. That's a distance, isn't it? So, it's very hard to keep control over it. So it was important politically, personally, financially, spiritually. So that's what Nehemiah faced. But then Nehemiah the man. First of all, we see that he's a man of prayer. First thing he does when he sees a problem, he prays. He prays. It's so hard to see a problem and pray about it, because actually, I don't know about you, I can be a bit like a bull in a china shop. I'm like, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to go in. I'm going to get it. But actually, we need to learn that the first thing we do when faced with a problem is we pray. Nehemiah the man was motivated by his desire to restore the reputation of Jerusalem, because he knew that by Jerusalem being in disgrace, the God of Jerusalem was held in contempt. And his motivation in all that he did was to restore Jerusalem and get God's people living God's way, which is what we do on a Sunday, isn't it? We want to be God's people living God's way. We don't just do it on a Sunday. We hear about it on a Sunday. We want to put it into practice through the week. And Nehemiah the man, there was a massive cost to him. He was in the capital of the most important empire at the time, in a position of authority, who had the ear of the king. And he had to travel 1,000 miles to a derelict city, not knowing what was going to be facing him. And it was so dangerous, he actually had an armed escort. So there was cost involved to Nehemiah, the man. So back to Philippians. We are to consider the needs of others, the interests of others, and not just our own interests. That's what Nehemiah was doing. I hope you can see the link now. I thought it was a really obvious link. But we are to consider the needs of others. It says right through the Bible that we are a body. Right through the New Testament, we are a body. And that no one can say to the other person in the church, I don't need you. We all need each other. And in Romans chapter 12 and verse 4, it actually even says this, that each member belongs to the others. So when you're strong, you make me stronger. And when I'm strong, I make you stronger. And that applies to every relationship within this church. We are a body, and we need to be strong by considering the needs of others. Galatians puts it as carrying one another's burdens. So wall building. I want to talk about wall building, and then later on we're going to get onto the Lego, okay? I haven't got Lego to play with, so just if any of you are thinking that, I'm sorry to disappoint, but I've got pictures of Lego. Wall building. Do you know what? Everyone was involved in wall building. Everyone was involved in it. Except, there is actually an exception. Chapter 3 and verse 5, it says, the next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulder to the work under their supervisors. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be listed as an exception in God's kingdom, do you? No, everyone was involved. Everyone was involved. There were people from the surrounding countryside came to help, not just those who lived in Jerusalem. And in Nehemiah, it lists over 40 sections of wall that were rebuilt, 40 different sections. And it's interesting that it starts the section with the sheep gate. Now, the sheep gate, if you look at maps of Jerusalem at the time, the sheep gate was in the northeast of the city, and it was the gate that was the nearest to the temple. And that was the gate that the sacrifices that were done on the altar, that's where it would have been brought in. So it's appropriate that they started there, although they were started there by listing it, they were working all the same at the same time. But actually they listed from there because if they wanted to be a people who worshipped God correctly, it started through that gate. Okay, I want to list the group of people that helped with the wall building, because I want to say, sometimes we talk about using our talents for God, but sometimes he wants us to use things that aren't our talents. And that's kind of challenging. So if God says to you, do something, and you say, I can't do that because that's not up my street, well, I'm going to point you to the list of Nehemiah. So the people that helped with the wall building were the priests. Okay? It wasn't their job to do wall building, but they did it. There were labourers. There were people that worked out in the fields. There were mayors of towns doing it. The rulers were getting their hands dirty. Do you know, I could comment so much on what's going on in our country right now with this. I'm not going to, but I said to Ruben, and I've said to Ruben for a long time, I am so glad, and I'm not being sarcastic, we have a leader in Jesus Christ who is someone that I am proud to get behind and to be called his follower. Because actually you look at what's going on and you just, well, despair. But anyway, so there were rulers of mayors were helping out. There were perfumers building walls. That's an interesting one, isn't it? What do you do? I'm a perfumer. Oh, that's great. See that stone there? Can you help? There were jewellers that were helping. And you know, these two groups really struck me that these were people where it cost them personally to help build the wall. Because perfumers, they would have relied on their sense of smell, wouldn't they? And a sense of smell is a very, very sensitive thing. And we find in, I can't remember, it's in Ezra or in Nehemiah, but it talks about the gates and the stones having been burnt and being scorched. So the perfumers who have that really sensitive nose are not just handling great big rocks and great big stones that are difficult. They're handling smelly stuff that's getting right up their nose and will actually make it hard for them to do their normal job, you know. And I find that really it really struck me that these people, there was a personal cost. It could have cost them their jobs, the ability to do their jobs. And jewellers, I mean, if you're a jeweller, you need fine motor skills, don't you? I mean, I can't think of anything worse for fine motor skills than lifting rocks up and shifting rocks, because you're guaranteed to whack your digits quite regularly, aren't you? Yeah. It cost them. It cost them. And we also hear of women being involved in the building. So many of them worked against their immediate best interests, but they worked because they were looking after the interests of others. And in a sense, they were putting Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4 into practice before it had come into being. There was a cost financially. We've heard about finance a lot recently. Rightly so, because finance is important. But there was financial advantage put aside. And there are quite a few areas on this that I want to look at. One is that the people in the fields were at a financial disadvantage because the labourers that normally worked in the fields and got money were working on the walls. So the people that were at home still in the fields, they sacrificed financially to help with the building. On a negative point of view, some of the rulers, the Jewish rulers, had actually been collecting money with interest. And And it meant that, and loaning money, and it meant that some people were actually so desperate to pay back, they were selling their children into slavery. The Bible says so much against that in Deuteronomy. So some Jews were doing that, and Nehemiah challenged them. And they said, we're going to set people free. We're going to not going to charge any interest anymore. So from a negative point of view financially, they got their situation sorted. And then a positive point of view is Nehemiah was appointed governor of Jerusalem. As governor, he was entitled to a wage. And that wage was, it was a certain amount of wheat, it was a certain amount of sheep and goats, it was a certain amount of wine, it was a certain amount of olive oil. And Nehemiah chose not to take that. And he did that because he was looking after the interests of others. And not only did he not claim what was his by right, he actually financially helped other people because he fed them as well. Rather than being fed by people below him, he fed those that needed it. Looking after the interests of others and not just your own. And you know, it's interesting because when they talk about building the wall, some people actually built the wall outside their immediate homes. And you think, oh, you know, how is that looking out for other people's interests if they're building the wall outside their own homes? Well, that's quite savvy by Nehemiah, because actually if you're getting people to work outside their own homes, they're going to be really invested in doing a good job, aren't they? But also, their building supported other people next to them, and we'll see that when we get to Lego. And I want to talk also about the partnership between Nehemiah and Ezra. It's a really, if you read the two together, the two people work so well. The practical and the spiritual mesh together. And so the result of this wall building was that the wall was completed. Not only was it completed in 52 days. 52 days. And this is what Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 16 said about this. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. People working together, the church working together, is a testimony to those outside the church. Paul spoke, didn't he, the other day when he was, a few weeks ago when he spoke about Alpha, and he said one of the biggest testimonies in Alpha was that people gave the food. That was a massive testimony to non-believers. I just think it's fab. Anyway, we're going to get onto the application now. How do events of 2,500 years ago mean anything to us now? Well, I think the first obvious thing is God works through history. He worked through the Assyrian Empire. He worked through the Babylonian Empire. He worked through the Persian Empire. And he worked with them, through them, to get what he wanted for his people. He used those empires to punish his people so that they would turn back to him, because God always, always, always punished his people, not because he wanted to, but his motivation was to get them to turn back to him. He worked through history through Nehemiah. He works now as well. Nehemiah, I wrote down when I read through the book, and I wrote down a sort of summary, and I said that actually Nehemiah had a determination to live life God's way. I think we'd agree with that, wouldn't we? That Nehemiah had a determination to live life God's way. And that's what it says in Philippians 1:27. Conduct your lives in a manner worthy of the gospel. We can't pretend it's going to be easy. There will be a cost, but the benefits are worth it. And I want to just look briefly at the opposition that Nehemiah faced, because it wasn't just one type of opposition. He felt that he faced all sorts of different types of opposition. So, first of all, when he comes to start rebuilding the walls, Sanballat and Tobiah, they start ridiculing him. Really? Really? You're going to build the walls? Really? The walls will be so pathetic that even if a fox walked on them, they'd fall down. That's what they said at one point. And actually, as Christians, we can face ridicule, and it's hard. It's hard. So just put yourself in this situation about the opposition that Nehemiah and the people rebuilding the walls felt, and kind of put yourself in there, because I think that we do face these things ourselves. They faced threats. If you carry on building, we're going to attack you. Now, they were empty threats, but they still faced threats. And when they didn't work, they faced raids. And when that didn't stop them, they tried befriending Nehemiah. Sanballat and Tobiah, they send him out an invitation. Come and join us. Come and join us in the countryside, 30 miles away from everyone else, and we'll have a nice party. It was a kidnap plot, and Nehemiah saw through it. But do you know what? Sometimes if the devil can't get the people in Jerusalem to stop what they're doing because they're all together, he'll try and pick us off one by one. And Nehemiah saw through it. Then there's a temptation to wrongdoing. What they did was Tobiah, he knew some people in Jerusalem, and he got them to spread a false rumour that there were people out to kill Nehemiah in Jerusalem, and say to Nehemiah, why don't you flee to the temple and be safe there? But the temptation in that was that actually Nehemiah knew that if he entered the temple, he wasn't a priest. He would have been violating God's command, and so he didn't fall for that trick either. And we see internal opposition as well. And these strategies are really similar to strategies today that the devil uses, but in the same way that Nehemiah countered every strategy. Sometimes he just ignored them. Sometimes he answered them, but he countered them all because he was a man that was motivated by prayer and by desiring to live life God's way. We can be the same. So for those of you that are visual thinkers, we're going to get onto Lego now. So if I could have the first slide, Alan, that would be lovely. This came up, excuse me, it was a screenshot, so you've got a few bits that shouldn't be on there. But this came up. It just came up on my phone one time. I've never looked at Lego on my phone before. But honestly, I laughed when I saw this because it is so shows what I'm talking about. So here we've got, if you have a look, you've got the little Lego man behind a single wall, and here you've got a cannon trying to demolish the wall. If I could have the next slide, please. You can only see 3 balls here. There were actually 4 balls they used. There's a plastic ball, then there's a glass marble, a stainless steel ball, and a tungsten carbide ball, okay? So there's 4 different types of ball, and each one is harder and stronger than the other, if you can think about the opposition, okay? So if I could have the next slide, please. With the hardest, strongest ball from the cannon, it needed 13 single walls before that Lego man was protected. Up until 12, the tungsten carbide ball obliterates 12. 13th, he survives. If I could have the next one, please. Now, this one is the tungsten carbide ball with 2. You can just see it. There's 2 walls side by side. 2 walls. And here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9. It needs 9 walls to protect against the strongest. If I could have the next slide, please. Quad walls. 4 walls linked together. Strongest one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it gets less. And if I could have the next one, please. 2 walls. When there's 8 there. Now, I know that everyone who's into physics, I failed my physics O-level a long, long time ago, but even I know that this is about distribution of force and how it works. But This is about looking after the interests of others. When we support one another, we're like those walls that can't be broken, no matter how strong the opposition. We form a wall that protects this. And then if I could have the final one, please. There are times when we don't have people round and about us. But do you know what? If you've got a single wall that is supported correctly, a single wall will withstand the strongest opposition. And do you know what it says in Psalms? Because God often is called our fortress and our refuge. In the Revised English Bible, it's not a translation I particularly like, apart from the Psalms. The Psalms are brilliant in it because they're designed to be real poetry. And there's a bit in the Revised English Bible where it talks about God being our buttress. And that is what, if I could have that last slide back up again. That's what these are here. Buttresses that support the wall. It's what you see on the outside of cathedrals, those little walls that stick out from the side. Those help support the wall. And God is our buttress. God is our buttress. Do you know, we've heard about testimonies just today and over the last few weeks about financial support. You know, how we can support one another financially. We can. It's lovely for the people that receive the finance, but it costs people who give it. But as Paul always says, we're sowing into God's kingdom, aren't we? We can support each other through prayer. We can support each other through time. We can support each other through our talents. But I don't want to just list about the ways that we can support one another, because sometimes the way our minds work is, she didn't actually mention about that, so therefore I don't have to do that because Catherine didn't mention that on a Sunday. Do you know what? God expects us to support one another in loads and loads and loads and loads of different ways. So if something about I'm talking to you about and it resonates within you, and that God's asking you to do something and you're like, well, Catherine didn't mention anything, it doesn't fit under finance, doesn't fit under prayer, doesn't fit under time, ask God about it. And if you really believe that that's a way that he wants you to support people within the church, then go for it. There is a cost when we support one another, but I think all of us would say that the benefits, even though it might be very long term, the benefits outweigh the cost. And I just want to finish by reading where Philippians 2 goes, because actually what Paul says is that we should have the same mindset as Christ. And it's not that we follow his example so that we can get a well done. We follow his example because he has given everything for us. And it says this: in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Thank you.